Welcome back to Transfer Talk, the podcast where we break down everything happening in the world of college athletics with a special focus on the transfer portal and how it's reshaping the game. I'm your host, Dylan Lucas, and today's episode is all about something that doesn't always show up in the stats or the headlines. It's about the locker room. We hear a lot about who's transferring, where they're going, and how it impacts a team on paper. But what about behind the scenes? What happens when rosters are constantly changing? Can teams really build chemistry when players are coming in and out every year? And maybe even more importantly, can you truly feel connected to a school if you're only there for a short period of time? All of that and more on today's episode. Before we get into the discussion, I want to set the stage a little bit. The transfer portal has completely changed college sports. It's given athletes more freedom and control over their careers, which is a good thing in a lot of ways. But with that freedom comes a new set of challenges, as we've all seen, especially when it comes to team culture and team identity. Think about it. In the past, a lot of teams were built around players who stayed for 3 or 4 years, programs built on it. You had time to grow together, struggle together, build relationships. Now, it's not uncommon for a team to have a large portion of its roster made up of transfers, or all of it made up of transfers, who maybe just arrived a few months ago. So the question becomes, can you really build a strong locker room when things are constantly changing? To dive further into that, and before I mention I understand the irony of the source here, I do want to mention a quick quote from now LSU head coach Lane Kiffin about what he said about the transfer portal. He says, quote, "I think that unfortunately the world we're in, it is not good. It's not good for college football. Professional sports don't have this amount of turnover. It's not good for locker rooms, and it's obviously not good for chemistry." Post quote. And I think that quote really captures the core of the issue, right? Talent might get you wins early, but chemistry a lot of times is what can carry teams through the tough moments. It's not to say that you can't get through it with transfer portal guys, but we've all seen that, the grittiness of a team that's been together for multiple years, and they know, just how each other is going to respond in pressure situations. When you've got those players that have been together for years, there's a level of trust that's there. Their tendencies and their shared experience. But with transfers, that timeline is greatly compressed, right? You might only have a few months to build that same level of trust. And that's obviously a tough situation. But it's not all negative. It's not all negative, right? Transfers also can bring new energy. They bring new perspective, new experience, and a lot of times leadership. Sometimes a player coming from a different program can raise the standard in a locker room. They've seen how other teams operate and can bring those habits with them. So in some ways, the transfer portal can actually help a team grow, but it's got to be handled the right way. Another question that comes up with this is connection. And it's not just to teammates, but to the school, to the institution. If you're only in a school for a year, 2 years, is it even possible to feel the same level of pride and identity as someone who's been there for 4, or those that have came before you? For some athletes, the answer is yes, right? They buy in right away, they embrace that culture, and they treat it like they've been there for 4 years. But for others, it might feel temporary, like a stop along the way, rather than a place that they belong to. And that can impact how they approach everything, from habits to leadership to how they even represent the program at large. And this is where I think it can get really interesting, this discussion, because it's not just about wins and losses anymore. It's about what, at its core, a team is. Is it a group of individuals trying to maximize their own opportunities? Or is it a collective unit that's building something together? Ideally, it's both. But finding that balance obviously isn't easy. Now, to bring in some real perspective into this conversation, I'm joined by someone who's living it right now. Brandon Little is a starting pitcher at Wofford, and he's experienced what it's like to be part of a college baseball locker room in this new era of the transfer portal. We're going to talk team chemistry, what it's like having new guys come in, and whether it changes the way players connect with each other and the program. All right, joining me now on Transfer Talk is, as I said, Wofford's starting pitcher Branton Little. Branton, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, man, of course, Dylan. Thank you for having me.
Yeah, so I just want to jump right in with the limited time we have. So, as I, have mentioned throughout the video, we're talking about team chemistry, as in regards to the transfer portal. So, what is the transfer portal, or what's the locker room dynamic like with the transfer portal, with players transferring in and out every year?
Yeah, I mean, the transfer portal has been sort of one of those things nowadays where it's just normal. It's very expected. I think, 2 to 3 years ago, it was something that was very unknown, and people were not necessarily scared, but maybe hesitant and anxious, especially coaches, just kind of getting into it because there are, like you said, those locker room dynamics that are affected. Um, I think, I think all in all, man, the chemistry has become very different. You're seeing people be a little bit more stubborn to their ways, to their habits. Um, you know, you're asking a kid to leave a program with all of his buddies and all of his friends that he had at one school and go join a different team who has completely different expectations, completely different habits, and ultimately a completely different culture. So it's a challenge for sure, but I think that the teams that adjust to it quicker and, for lack of a better word, just better, you see those teams succeed with the transfer portal.
So you mentioned habits, so let's talk about that. I was going to ask that a few questions down the line. How do you blend, whether it be practices or approaches, how do you blend habits that maybe you've had because you've been at Wofford for 4 years versus someone that had maybe been at multiple different schools and they come in with those different habits? How do you blend those two together so everyone's kind of rowing in the same direction?
Yeah, I think there's a very happy medium with that. You don't want to sit there and say this is the way I do things is right, or and the way that you do things is wrong. I think that's again like nowadays the way I see it is the best coaches nowadays are able to take this incoming transfers habits and take the good parts of it and say, okay, I've got to take a look in the mirror at my team and my team's habits and say, okay, does this guy do things better than the way we do things? Like honestly, and it takes a lot of courage to do that. But those are the most successful coaches. I think on a personal level, people have social habits and people have routine habits that maybe they're set in doing. I think the most simple one would be like the time that you lift in a day. We lift later in the day on average, and most teams talk about lifting at 6 a.m. and this
Right.
and that. And I think there's an adjusting period to that. I know it's a very simple concept, but it's like that throws a dude's schedule off if he's used to lifting early in the morning. So I think it's with those social and day-to-day habits, I think the biggest thing is taking the best parts of each and using each other to find the best process that works for everyone involved.
Yeah. So let me ask you this. Do you feel like it takes longer now for teams to build chemistry?
I mean, I think the easy answer would be yes. I mean, it's obviously you have so many different personalities. Um, Even my freshman year, when the transfer portal wasn't really a thing, there were still so many different personalities coming from people throughout the region, and now I'm going to college with people from Washington and California,
Right.
Oklahoma, Colorado. Like it's expanding and diversifying so much to a point where honestly you worry about it less. You know that people are going to be different at this point. And people are going to see things different than the way you do. So it's definitely harder, but it gives it more of a professional feel in the sense that like everyone's there to do one job, and that's win a baseball game on a daily basis. And I think it has its byproducts both directions.
Yeah. So let me say this. How do y'all, because you mentioned you have players from all over the country, how do returning players such as yourself help integrate these new players into your environment, into the team, into the coaching style, into Spartanburg? Like, how do y'all go about that? Do y'all hang out with them more? Like what do you guys do to kind of ease that in?
Yeah, I think what's so great about Walford is like because of how small of a school this is, like in the best way possible, man, we have no choice but to hang out with each other.
Mm.
Um, and so it forces that blend. You know, I think as returning players, when you have guys transferring in, it's very easy to let them believe they can do their own thing. And, you know, they often live off campus, so they're not around us as much and they're, you know, doing their own thing. But man, the best thing is just getting around each other and blending. You know, just mere exposure to each other creates chemistry and creates, you know, some sort of bond. We're all going to go through a ton of adversity together in this season, so it's just so important to get that out of the way early, and understanding like how big of a deal it is here, especially to be close with these guys and you know be able to talk to someone about anything.
Yeah, that makes sense. My final question, Brandon, is do you think players feel or can feel as connected to the program if they're only there for a short amount of time? You've been there for 4 years. Obviously, you know the campus, you know, even things like the fight song, just, you know, some athletes don't know at schools.
Yeah.
Um, do you think that they can feel as connected?
Uh, I I think the strong cultured programs, I think you can. I also think that if you look at a big school basis, I think it's very hard. I think nowadays it's a very pro baseball esque clubhouse locker room feel to a sense that you're assembling a bunch of players to do their own thing on a baseball field and hopefully you win. And I think at a school like Walford, you're still assembling a team to play as a team as opposed to 9 individuals on a field at a time.
Mm.
Um, so it's definitely challenging. I'd be lying to you if I said it's easier to get transfers acclimated and you know willing to join this culture. I a good example, like I played summer ball in Culpeper, Virginia, with one of my teammates, and now one of another current teammate. He transferred in from Pitt, and I think the coolest thing about that was, you know, him being in the transfer portal, not knowing where to go. Like those guys want a good culture fit, and what gave him such a great chance to know Walford was the right place for him was being able to interact with my teammate and I that were in Culpeper with him and saying, okay, if this is what half the guys at Walford are like, maybe this is a good fit. So it goes a long way, and there's definitely a people side of it, especially for someone who's looking to transfer into a smaller school to play more. But I think it depends on the size and the scale of the school. But long story short, yes, I would say that it's definitely more challenging nowadays.
Yeah. Well, that makes a lot of sense. Branton, that's all I got. Thanks so much for joining me. I appreciate it. You provided some good insight and perspective. And I look forward to the next time we speak.
Yeah, sounds good, Dylan. Thank you again for having me.
All right. Well, that was really great perspective from Branton. And I, again, like to thank him for joining. And I think it really highlights something important. Chemistry isn't just about time, it's about effort. Even if players are only together for a short period, teams that are intentional about building relationships can still come together in a meaningful way. So with all of this being said, where does that leave us? The transfer portal isn't going anywhere. If anything, it's only going to become a bigger part of college sports. That means teams, coaches, and players are all going to have to adapt. From a locker room standpoint, it puts more pressure on leadership. Coaches have to be more deliberate about their culture. Players have to be more open to building relationships. And everyone has to have the same buy-in to the program. Alrighty, that's going to do it for today's episode of Transfer Talk. Again, huge thanks to Branton Little for joining the show today. If you enjoyed the episode, please make sure to follow our podcast and stay tuned for more episodes and conversations regarding the transfer portal. I'm your host, Dylan Lucas, and I'll talk to you next time. Bye-bye.